I was hanging out with a friend of mine last week. Let's call her Maya. She is, objectively a catch. Successful, attractive, smart. But for 20 minutes straight, she was just completely silent, face lit up by the blue light of her phone, her thumb just moving in this rhythmic, almost trance-like motion, left, left, left. And then suddenly she stopped. She turned the screen to me, and she showed me a profile. It's a guy who looked like a movie star, hiking in the Swiss Alps, listed as a trauma surgeon. By all the traditional metrics, this was the jackpot, right? But then something really strange happened. She matched with him, and instead of smiling or, typing a message, she just lets out this heavy, defeated sigh, and she tossed the phone onto the couch, face down. "I'm just so tired," she said. And it was such a jarring contradiction. She just secured what should have been a victory in the dating marketplace, but she looked like she had just finished a grueling shift at work. Watching her, it just clicked for me. She wasn't looking at a human being. She was reacting to what evolutionary biologists call a supernormal stimulus. She was exactly like a bird ignoring its own real eggs to sit on a giant, brightly colored fake one because its brain tricked it into thinking bigger meant better. Maya wasn't ungrateful, and she wasn't broken. She was just a victim of a biological glitch, trying to run brand new complex software on a piece of hardware that hasn't had a system update in 200,000 years.
And that profound ache of modern dating, that sigh your friend Maya let out, that's exactly the core conflict we are diving into today. You described the situation perfectly. We live in this era of incredible technological achievement where the geographical constraints on connection have been completely shattered. Millions of potential partners are available just a swipe away. It's a dating pool that is orders of magnitude larger than any human has ever faced in history. Yes. And yet we have a generation reporting this deep, profound sense of dissatisfaction and escalating loneliness.
The paradox of choice.
Mm-hmm.
Just amplified to a global scale. I remember seeing that data point you mentioned. It's stunning. Surveys are showing that over half of singles report feeling lonelier after using these apps.
After using them, not before.
Exactly. And a really significant chunk, about a third of younger users, say the apps contributed substantially to their feelings of isolation and inadequacy. So the system promises all this freedom and connection, but it's delivering psychological fatigue and just disappointment.
It's because the system isn't merely broken. It is actively working against our innate biology in an environment our brains were never ever designed to handle. So, our deep dive today is focused on unpacking this. And to do that, we need to define and really examine two foundational concepts. Understanding these is the key to understanding why Maya sighed instead of celebrated.
Okay, let's unpack this. So the first foundational concept we really need to get our heads around is evolutionary mismatch.
Right. Think of it this way. Despite the rapid acceleration of culture and technology over the last few thousand years, the core operating system of the human brain, the biological hardware, it remains anatomically and functionally pretty similar to our Stone Age ancestors. And that brain is exquisitely adapted for survival in a small, stable, but also very unpredictable ancestral environment. Yeah. It's fantastic at assessing risk, at forming tight social bonds, and navigating the politics of a small tribe.
But it struggles profoundly with situations that are radically modern.
Exactly. Our brain evolved to crave salt, sugar, and fat because those were essential but very rare calorie sources. Now those elements are cheap, they're limitless, and they're highly engineered into fast food, which leads to our modern obesity crises. The mismatch is that the ancient wiring, designed to seek scarcity, now encounters this insane abundance. And in mating, the mismatch is arguably even more severe. We went from a constrained face-to-face tribe of maybe 150 people to a digital marketplace containing millions of carefully curated, hyper-real profiles.
And the second concept, the element that makes those fast food cravings or those perfect profiles so irresistible, is the supernormal stimulus.
A supernormal stimulus is an exaggerated imitation of a naturally evolved phenomenon that, and this is the crucial part, elicits a stronger innate response than the natural object itself. It's basically a trick played on our sensory and cognitive systems. The classic examples come from ethology, the study of animal behavior, where researchers like Tinbergen and Lorenz found that animals could be reliably fooled.
Like the bird ignoring its own eggs to sit on a gigantic fake egg.
Precisely. The bird's innate mechanism just registers bigger size and brighter color as superior, healthier stimuli. And that triggers a maximally strong parental response. It can't help itself. Our human brains are also wired for these kinds of shortcuts, whether it's high-heeled shoes creating an exaggerated lumbar curvature that cues sexual availability, or, most critically, for us, the highly optimized, filtered, and status-laden digital profiles we see online. It's all supernormal stimulus, hijacking primal urges for reproductive success.
Okay, so we have this ancient optimized brain, the mismatch, and it's being fed these exaggerated, almost unnatural cues, the supernormal stimulus, and what is probably the single most critical area of human life, finding a partner. That context sets the stage perfectly for this chronic psychological fatigue and ultimately the mass dissatisfaction that we're all seeing.
Right. And to really understand the efficiency of this digital hack, we first have to dive into the foundational code of human mating. And that is governed by something called parental investment theory. This theory, which was developed by Robert Trivers, it explains why there are such striking sex differences in behavior and mate preferences across the entire animal kingdom.
And this really boils down to the massive asymmetry in the reproductive effort between the sexes, doesn't it?
Absolutely. We have to look at the investment required. For a woman, the reproductive cost is just immense. It's non-negotiable and it's front-loaded. You're talking about 9 months of pregnancy, the significant physical risk of childbirth, and then the physiological necessity of nursing. This is biologically unavoidable, and it sets a very, very high minimum investment bar.
And on the other side of the ledger, a man's minimum biological investment is, well, trivially small, a matter of minutes.
Correct. And this asymmetry creates radically different strategic realities. Because the female cost is so high, the female brain evolved to be intensely, you could even say ruthlessly, selective. The cost of choosing a bad mate, a man who lacks resources or protection or stability, is catastrophic for her and for her high investment offspring. Her selectivity is literally driven by survival.
I see. So the male brain, which is facing lower minimum costs and high reproductive variance, meaning one successful pairing, could dramatically increase his fitness. It evolved to be more competitive and more open to opportunistically seeking multiple partners. It's a core design feature. It's in our factory settings.
And that difference in strategy requires a constant, rapid assessment of potential partners. And this leads to the development of what we call mate value.
Mate value, that invisible marketplace score.
Yeah.
We're constantly assessing this, even if we don't realize it, right? We're running this hidden calculation in the background of every social interaction.
It is the ultimate invisible marketplace score, yes. Mate value is an aggregate assessment. It's based on all these visible cues of health, fertility, status, resources, intelligence, character. We are wired to constantly and subconsciously assess this in others, and we're often comparing it against our own perceived value. It's how our brains efficiently determine who is a viable partner, who is a potential threat, and who is a potential competitor.
And this is the evolutionary underpinning for the concept that often generates the most controversy in modern discussions: hypergamy.
We really need to define hypergamy neutrally here and shed all the modern, often negative connotations. Scientifically, hypergamy is simply the observable, cross-cultural tendency for women to seek a partner of equal or, more often, higher perceived mate value. And we have to stress that in the ancestral environment, this was not some social preference. It was a necessary and deeply adaptive survival strategy.
Okay, so why was seeking a higher value mate so critical for survival in that specific environment?
Because it maximized the chances of offspring survival. It's that simple. Let's go back to that ancestral tribe, that tightly knit, constrained group of maybe 150 individuals. If a woman chose the man who was demonstrably the better hunter, or the one with slightly higher influence and status, she was ensuring better resource allocation, better protection, and greater overall genetic quality for the child she invested so much in. Her choices were highly constrained by geography and social familiarity. The best man in that tribe was still a real human being. She knew his flaws, his laziness on certain days, his visible defects.
So she had access to the best available real option, but it was constrained within a manageable, tangible tribe.
That is the pivotal contrast. Now, we take that finely tuned hypergamous drive, which was calibrated for a small village, and we plug it into the modern digital dating app, which is a global competition pool of millions. This is where the evolutionary mismatch becomes not just inconvenient, but psychologically punishing.
So if hypergamy means seeking the best available partner, and my brain is suddenly presented with this unconstrained pool featuring the top 1% of status, resources, and aesthetic curation globally, the trauma surgeon in the Alps, that innate drive just follows the signal.
And the drive for hypergamy is transformed into a profound source of chronic dissatisfaction. The brain, which is just seeking to maximize this invisible score, suddenly finds that its local reality is completely overshadowed by an artificial global standard that is, well, mathematically unattainable for most users. The digital marketplace weaponizes hypergamy.
So we've established the evolutionary wiring. Now let's jump into how these digital platforms leverage the concept of the supernormal stimulus to trigger and ultimately exploit that ancient wiring. It all starts with creating these hyper-real digital avatars.
Indeed. A dating profile is a marvel of curation. It's not just a person. It's a meticulously edited, filtered, and context-removed presentation of a self. The photos are optimized for lighting and filtering. The bios are, AI prompted or polished to showcase only the peak moments, like exotic travel, high-status jobs, or socially valuable hobbies.
They are the digital equivalent of that brightly colored giant fake egg.
Exactly. They are digital avatars designed to be the brightest, most attractive fake eggs possible, and they overwhelm the mate value detection systems in our brains. They present an idealized, unconstrained version of health, status, and attractiveness, often exaggerating the very traits that evolution selected for. And when our ancient hardware sees this idealized signal, it just screams priority target, maximize reproductive investment.
That perfectly describes the mechanism fueling the situation we saw with someone like Chloe, the UI of illusion. She's successful, she's ready for a meaningful relationship, but she just can't physically move past this digital parade.
The system is actively raising her standards to an unattainable level, and by doing that, it's sabotaging her satisfaction with any real-world partners. Because the app constantly parades the algorithmically prioritized top 1% in front of her, the models, the doctors, the adventurers, it artificially inflates her threshold for what she sees as an acceptable partner. Her brain's expectations are literally being reset by these supernormal stimuli, pushing the goalposts further and further away.
And the result isn't just a tough dating life, it's paralyzing choice overload. She's got thousands of options in her pocket, but when she meets the decent architect who is stable and kind, he just feels like a profound lack of chemistry compared to the hyper-real avatar she's been consuming.
And we have to emphasize the neurochemical impact here. The constant intermittent reward schedule of swiping and that momentary validation of a match, that's a dopamine hit, it conditions the brain to seek the next, even more intense stimulus. After repeated exposure to this digital hyperreality, those dopamine receptors are, for lack of a better word, fried. So when she encounters genuine human connection, which is subtle, it's complex, it's slow to reward, it registers as fundamentally boring. The brain has been conditioned to demand a supernormal intensity that real life just cannot deliver.
To truly grasp the magnitude of this supernormal stimulus, what our preferences look like when they are completely unconstrained by reality, politeness, or reciprocity, we have to turn to that incredibly strange and telling source of data, commercially available sex dolls.
Right. This analysis of 793 commercially available female sex dolls, it provides a unique and totally unfiltered window into male mate preferences. Because they bypass all biological and social constraints, they don't age, they require no courtship, they don't have opinions, they reflect pure, consumer-driven desire. This allows researchers to test evolutionary hypotheses at the absolute extreme end of the preference spectrum.
So what does this unconstrained view tell us about the evolutionary strategy? Are men still primarily seeking peak fertility, which we know occurs in the mid to late 20s, or is it something else?
Well, the data overwhelmingly supported what's called the nubility hypothesis over the current fertility hypothesis. Nubility refers to the developmental phase signaling long-term reproductive potential. So, the period following menarche, but preceding the first pregnancy. In well-nourished populations, this roughly corresponds to ages 15-19. The doll design is optimized for cues of long-term youth and nulliparity, which means having never given birth.
Wait, hang on. Why would evolution favor cues of nubility over peak current fertility? Isn't fertility the immediate goal?
It sounds counterintuitive, but the adaptive rationale is very sound, particularly in ancestral environments with high infant mortality and low life expectancy. Selecting a nubile mate maximizes the number of fertile years available to the man, securing the opportunity to sire multiple offspring before she becomes non-reproductive. And what's more, research suggests that in environments without modern surgical intervention, younger nulliparous women, so in that 16-20 range, they had significantly lower rates of life-threatening labor complications and higher fetal survival rates compared to slightly older first-time mothers. So this provided a massive fitness advantage to the man who was sensitive to those nubility cues.
That's fascinating. So the brain is optimized to identify the longest possible reproductive runway. And how did the physical measurements of the dolls confirm that they are supernormal?
The most powerful evidence is in the classic measure of female attractiveness, the waist-to-hip ratio, or WHR. Research on real women consistently shows an attractive range clustered around a mean WHR of about 0.85. The sex dolls, however, exhibited a significantly lower mean WHR of 0.62.
A pedio 0.62 WHR is. That's physically extreme for a real human woman, outside of specific, highly curated body types.
It is extreme, and statistically, the difference between the artificial preference and the natural average yielded a very large effect size, quantified as D equals 3.23. To put that in perspective for you, an effect size of 0.8 is generally considered large in psychology.
Right.
AD of 3.23 is it's overwhelming. It's a nearly categorical difference, an effect size you rarely see outside of physics. It means that the preference for the supernormally low WHR is absolute and non-negotiable in this artificial design.
That is a staggering piece of data. And the research also managed to solve a long-standing debate, didn't it? Whether men prefer a low ratio or just a narrow waist size, independent of the hips.
Yes, that is the crucial nugget of insight we extracted here. For decades, researchers debated whether men were primarily selecting for the ratio itself, so hips must be wider than the waist, or if waist narrowness, which is a direct signal of nulliparity and lack of caloric stress, was the real driving factor. The sex doll data strongly supported the latter.
Tell us how that data revealed the primacy of the waist.
When analyzing the artificial bodies, the researchers discovered that waist narrowness appeared to be the primary selection criterion. It's a non-negotiable feature of the design. And we know this because the dolls exhibited 52% more variability in hip size than they did in waist size. So manufacturers allowed hips to vary much more widely, but the waist size was strictly constrained.
So the hips might be flexible, a kind of luxury addition, but the narrow waist is a biological necessity in this marketplace.
Exactly. And the numbers reinforce this. The average waist circumference of the dolls was approximately 55 centimeters. That's about 21.6 inches. Now contrast this with the average waist circumference of real women in developed nations, which is closer to 85 centimeters. That's almost a third smaller. The artificial waist is designed to be supernormally impossibly narrow.
That perfectly explains why historical fashion trends like corsetry and modern trends like waist trainers even exist. They are all human attempts to manually generate this powerful supernormal stimulus to trigger that ancient preference for a narrow waist.
And we see this exaggeration across other traits designed to cue youth and fitness too. For example, nearly half of the female dolls, 48.6%, had cup sizes ranging from E to O, which vastly exceeds the common range observed in real women. It's a clear, unconstrained preference for hypersexualized proportions.
What about small feet? That's a subtle cue often associated with delicacy in youth.
The analysis confirmed this as well. Female dolls had disproportionately small feet relative to their stature, which supports the idea that small feet cue nubility. The reasoning is evolutionary. Functional biomechanics would predict that pregnancy and carrying a child would select for proportionately larger female feet to enhance stability. Therefore, small feet serve as an exaggerated cue that the woman is likely nulliparous, that she has never undergone the trauma of childbirth.
It's truly eye-opening to see how every trait, when it's unconstrained, is pushed to its extreme evolutionary boundary. Yet there was one major finding that deviated from this pattern height.
Yes, that was the anomalous finding. Both male and female dolls were significantly shorter than their human counterparts. And the male dolls were even more disproportionately short compared to real men than the female dolls were compared to real women. This is a fascinating example of market logistics overriding an evolutionary preference. We know women generally prefer taller men, but the demands of manufacturing, shipping logistics, and storage, just making the product cheaper and easier to transport, overrode the mate preference in this one domain.
So if we take these findings of unconstrained supernormal desire, the 0.62 WHR, the 55 centimeter waist, the exaggerated youth cues, and we pivot back to the digital avatar on the dating app, we see why the mismatch is so potent. It leads directly to the core finding of Dr. Aris, the data of distorted desire.
Dr. Aris's research quantified the behavioral consequence of exposure to this hyperreality. They found that subtle, digitally altered photos, widened eyes, squared jawlines, perfect lighting, all mimicking the supernormal vitality. They didn't just attract attention, they actively devalued the perception of realistic human features.
Meaning, participants were exposed to the digitally enhanced version, and afterward, when they rated the original unretouched realistic photo, they rated it significantly lower than a control group that had never seen the enhanced version.
Correct. The technology is not just satisfying a preference, it is rewriting the neurological baseline of human attraction. The subtle alterations are exploiting an error management bias. Evolution made it adaptive for us to err on the side of caution. It's better to select the mate with the exaggerated cue of fitness than to risk selecting a low fertility mate. Dating apps capitalize on this, pushing the visual cues to the very edge of the naturally occurring range, which systematically makes the real average look unattractive. We're being trained to find reality lacking.
So the system is designed to exploit the hardwiring that screams lower WHR is better. And it delivers an infinite curated stream of hyper-real digital avatars that satisfy that scream, training the user to perpetually find their real-world options boring.
And this brings us to the operational phase of the problem, the design architecture itself. Dating apps are sophisticated, effective infrastructures. They are structures designed to mediate human emotion and social interaction, but they are optimized rigorously for continuous interaction and data extraction, not for user well-being or successful pairing.
That is the fundamental tension, the Tinder paradox, right? Yeah. The user's goal is success, which means finding a match and leaving the platform. But the platform's incentive is failure. It needs you to maintain continuous chronic engagement for ad revenue and subscription upgrades.
And this tension is managed through manipulative design. The apps employ features like infinite scrolling, limited daily matches, intermittent reinforcement schedules, urgent notifications. These are all gamification tactics that leverage known psychological vulnerabilities, specifically reward anticipation and compulsion loops. These are features designed to delay decision-making and ensure compulsive usage patterns,
which naturally leads to psychological harm. Emotional distress, cognitive fatigue, and an impaired capacity to make informed decisions about ending your app usage. We see the real-world consequence of this in the story of Liam, the silent epidemic of invisibility.
Liam represents the average user, someone who, in the ancestral tribe, would have had clear, demonstrable value through his character, his skill, his contribution. But in the digital marketplace, the algorithmic prioritization of high engagement profiles pushes the average decent user to the bottom of the stack. He is subjected to silence and functional invisibility.
That silence must be devastating. The public health implications here are massive. Liam internalizes this algorithmic silence, his lack of matches or responses, as proof of his own social worthlessness. The loneliness is compounded, escalating into depression, withdrawal, and genuine mental health crises.
It creates a socioeconomic crisis that's disguised as a simple dating slump. When large segments of the young adult population internalize this sense of invisibility and worthlessness, you see tangible costs. Reduced productivity, withdrawal from social life, and increased healthcare burdens due to mental health issues. The platform, through its very design, contributes to a collective anxiety disorder.
The gravity of this issue has now pushed it beyond just consumer dissatisfaction and into the highest levels of legal scrutiny, particularly regarding how manipulative AI operates. We need to clarify the legal distinction here. What separates acceptable competitive persuasion from unacceptable covert manipulation in this digital domain?
This distinction is crucial in law. Persuasion involves openly presenting arguments or facts or incentives, allowing the individual to engage in conscious reflection and informed decision-making. Manipulation, conversely, is a deliberate, systematic, and covert practice that bypasses conscious reflection and informed consent to influence a person's behavior. Manipulation is legally problematic because it undermines the very foundation of consent. It impairs an individual's capacity for reflective, voluntary choice, which lawyers call cognitive autonomy.
So if a design feature is engineered to trigger an irresistible compulsion, say a notification timed precisely when I am most vulnerable to impulse spending, or intentionally slowing down the matching process to encourage a subscription, it crosses the line from persuasion to manipulation.
Precisely. And this is the focus of the EU Artificial Intelligence Act, specifically Article 5(1)(a). This provision establishes high-risk classifications and prohibitions, specifically targeting AI systems that use subliminal or manipulative techniques that materially distort behavior and impair informed decision-making.
That term, materially distort, sounds like a very high bar. How could a dating app, which is, ostensibly just a recommendation engine, meet that standard?
The distortion standard is met if the system's subtle design impairs a user's decision-making capacity significantly. Dating apps operate in an environment of massive asymmetrical power. They hold vast quantities of behavioral data on the user when they swipe, why they pause, what keeps them engaged, and they use that data to refine algorithms that exploit psychological weaknesses, reinforcing compulsive behaviors and maximizing usage time over user success.
Can you give us a concrete example of material distortion in this context?
Sure. Consider the feature of variable reinforcement. The app controls the release of matches, the reward. By making rewards intermittent and unpredictable, the system leverages the same compulsion loops you find in slot machines. When this is coupled with a user who is already emotionally vulnerable, like Liam, internalizing invisibility, the system is deliberately engineered to reinforce addictive behavior to prolong engagement. It's preventing them from making the rational decision to step away or seek real-world options. That is a material distortion of behavior.
And the legal focus is on the accumulation of these small harms, cumulative harm.
Exactly. The alleged harms, the emotional exhaustion, the decreased agency, the chronic dissatisfaction, these are not isolated accidents. They are predictable patterns that accrue over time due to the design itself. This cumulative harm is a key focus in the legal framework because it demonstrates a systematic undermining of autonomy.
And since dating apps are mediating such a sensitive part of life relationship formation, there's also a fundamental human rights issue at play here under the European Convention on Human Rights.
Yes, specifically ECHR Article 8. It protects an individual's right to respect for their private and family life, and implicitly, their psychological integrity and personal autonomy. Since dating apps mediate the very construction of identity and desire, covert commercial manipulation in this context may constitute an interference with these rights. The legal analysis has to determine whether the exploitative design environment renders genuine autonomy ineffective.
So if the platform is covertly profiling and exploiting emotional vulnerability through dark patterns and is doing it solely for profit maximization, that suggests that the user is being treated merely as an instrument for achieving external goals, which violates the underlying principle of personal dignity and autonomy protected under the ECHR.
The manipulation is particularly egregious in the sensitive domain because it targets the user's deep-seated need for affiliation and self-worth. Dark patterns like confusing subscription renewals or features that intentionally mislead to capitalize on cognitive fatigue, they further erode the legitimacy of user actions and consent. The system makes it harder to leave than it is to stay, and that fundamentally limits your agency.
Okay, let's connect all these threads back to the physical hardware we started with, the brain. If these apps are exploiting the supernormal stimulus and using manipulative design, is there measurable physical evidence suggesting this digital compulsion mirrors traditional addiction?
The evidence is compelling, yes. Neuroscientific research provides a very strong argument that internet-related addictive behaviors share similar underlying neural processes with chemical substance addictions. The behaviors that repeatedly reinforce the reward, motivation, and memory circuitry, like the intermittent rewards of swiping, are operating as supernormal stimuli.
Because they activate our neural pleasure circuits at a frequency and intensity far higher than our ancestors ever encountered in the natural world.
And that intense, continuous activation makes the brain susceptible to switching into an addictive mode. The core mechanism involves the mesocorticolimbic reward system, sometimes called the brain's motivation highway. It's the same circuit activated by psychoactive substances like nicotine, cocaine, and alcohol. This shared mechanism means the process of behavioral addiction, whether it's compulsive gambling, internet gaming, or obsessive internet use, involves fundamentally similar neural processes.
And we could draw strong parallels from neuroimaging studies in the field of compulsive sexual behavior, or CSB, what's also called internet pornography addiction, which also rely on digital supernormal stimuli.
Right. Studies on IPA provide clear, concrete evidence of these shared addiction mechanisms. When subjects diagnosed with compulsive sexual behaviors are shown visual cues, neuroimaging reveals significant activation in the same limbic system and reward circuitry. Specifically, the amygdala and the ventral striatum that we see activated when cocaine addicts view drug cues. The neurological machinery for processing rewards, whether they're chemical or digital, is inherently linked.
And what about the concept of tolerance? The need for higher and higher doses of the stimulus, which is a hallmark of addiction.
Tolerance and desensitization are measurable effects. Prolonged, intense exposure correlates with measurable changes in brain structure and activity. For example, some studies correlated higher hours per week of explicit online viewing with lower gray matter volume in the right caudate.
Wait, what does the right caudate do, and why is less gray matter there significant?
The caudate nucleus is deeply involved in goal-directed behavior and habit formation. So lower gray matter volume in the right caudate, which we see in subjects with IPA, suggests structural changes associated with the reinforcement of compulsive habitual behavior. It's structural evidence that the brain is adapting to the repeated, intense stimulus by altering the machinery responsible for controlling those habits. And even more telling is the reduced activity. Researchers found lower left putamental activity in response to sexual stimuli in these subjects. The putamen is another core part of the striatum, heavily involved in reward processing and motivation. Lower activity there suggests a downregulation of the natural neural response. The brain has become so flooded by the hyperstimulation that it desensitizes itself, requiring perpetually stronger stimuli to achieve the same level of reward.
That perfectly explains the emotional desensitization we see in the dating app user. If the brain is physically downregulating its response to natural stimuli, of course the decent real-life architect feels boring compared to the trauma surgeon avatar. The brain demands the supernormal intensity it has been trained on.
And finally, we see evidence of impaired decision-making. Internet addiction behaviors are strongly linked to deficits in executive control and higher impulsivity.
Executive control. That's the brain's ability to manage decision-making, suppress urges, and focus on long-term goals. How do we see that deficit manifest in the brain?
Well, studies using neurophysiological markers found that individuals with internet addiction showed decreased error-related negativity potentials. This is a specific electrophysiological marker that illustrates when the brain is attempting to correct a faulty cognition or suppress an inappropriate response. The decreased activity suggests that the individual has difficulty suppressing the urge for the short-term digital reward, the swipe, the notification. Despite being fully aware of the negative long-term consequences like loneliness or distress.
So the addiction literally hijacks the capacity for free, informed decision-making. It mirrors the legal concept of the material distortion of behavior we were just talking about. The physical hardware is compromised by the relentless supernormal input that's designed to maximize compulsive engagement. This deep dive has provided a comprehensive and, I have to say, genuinely unsettling view into the digital age's most profound psychological trap. To synthesize our findings, we are operating with an ancient Stone Age brain, hardwired for selective high-investment mating driven by hypergamy. This innate critical need is systematically exploited by digital avatars, the Supernormal Stimulus, which delivers exaggerated cues of fertility, youth, and status that simply do not exist in reality.
And this supernormal exposure simultaneously fuels a digital marketplace that is not designed for your success or fulfillment, but for chronic compulsive engagement. The entire effective infrastructure, from gamified interfaces to algorithmic invisibility, is optimized for profit, creating a system that weaponizes the evolutionary mismatch and causes measurable psychological and public health harm.
And the neurobiological data confirms it. Continuous, intense exposure to this digital hyperstimulus mirrors the patterns of behavioral addiction, leading to desensitization, structural brain changes like reduced gray matter volume, and a loss of executive control that impairs rational decision-making.
The ultimate consequence is that the system, from the hard-coded evolutionary mismatch in our heads to the profit-driven algorithmic structures of our devices, is engineered to make the nuanced, complex, and slow-rewarding nature of the real world look pale by comparison. By continuously feeding us hyper-real stimuli, the system is actively rewriting the baseline of what it means to be attractive or to feel connection, conditioning us to find reality itself profoundly unsatisfying.